Welcome to Bourbon and Beats. You know, age 12 is an age of transition for most of us. We're far from the adult that we're going to become, but we have started to gain some of those characteristics that are going to be a part of our adult personality. We've started to develop some likes and dislikes that are going to help form the person that we're going to be. When I was 12, my favorite TV show was Miami Vice. My favorite author was S.E. Hinton. My favorite cola, Cherry Coke. Favorite candy bar, Milky Way. Still have a problem staying away from those, by the way. And my favorite band was Duran Duran. Now, Duran Duran has come up briefly several times on this show already. I mentioned them as pioneers of the new romantic movement during the Culture Club episode. I mentioned them last week in the conversation that I shared with you that my brother and I had. And they came up again in a second interview that I just shot that will probably be next week's episode. And having mentioned them so many times, it just felt like the right time to go ahead and talk about them further, since they've been one of the most influential bands in my life, especially in the early years. So with this week, we're going to talk about Duran Duran's landmark album, Rio. And in pairing Rio with a bourbon for this week's show, I was scanning the shelves and had a true laugh out loud moment. In fact, it was a prolonged giggle that I had to explain to my dog Ollie, and he still didn't get it after I explained it to him. But I think you will get the joke in just a few minutes. This week's bourbon is Colonel E.H. Taylor Small Batch Bourbon. I've mentioned before that Culture Club's Color by Numbers was the first album that I ever bought with my own money. Unfortunately, it was also the last good album that Culture Club made. Boy George's personal problems with addiction kind of derailed the band, and so all of us fans were left wanting for good material. Now, they did put out another album shortly after that, but it did not measure up to the first two. So fortunately, I had discovered a new favorite band, also through MTV, that kind of filled that void for me, and that was Duran Duran. I've mentioned them several times recently and wanted to dive a little bit deeper into how important they were for me and how I see them. They get a bad rap as just a pin-up band or a boy band or a band that got by on style and looks rather than substance. But nothing could be farther from the truth. Okay, a couple of the later albums maybe were a little bit on the bubblegum side. But the first two albums they made were cutting-edge new wave that I put up against anything that came out in that second British invasion between 1980 and 1986. And I do mean anything. They were cutting-edge new wave albums. This is the second of those two albums, and we're going to talk a little bit about it today. But first, just a little bit about the band and how they formed. The band formed in 1978 in Birmingham, England. Two friends, Nick Rhodes and John Taylor, decided they wanted to form a band, and the funny thing was neither one of them could play much music really at that point. But they had a lot of belief, a lot of confidence, and they had drive and ambition. And they began to learn their instruments. John, the bass guitar and the regular guitar as well, and Nick learned keyboards. And they started playing with friends and people they knew in the area, and starting to get better and better, and started to experiment quite a bit with new sounds and to find their own voice. Around that time, they started performing and working in a club called the Rum Runner. The owners of that club were two brothers, Paul and Michael Barrow. And the Barrow brothers took them under wing as a project and said, hey, you guys keep doing what you're doing. We'll be your management team, and we'll also give you jobs here in the club so that you've got something to do to make a little money while you continue to pursue your art. And so Nick became the club's DJ. John and Roger, the drummer, who had come on board by then, were bartenders, doormen, whatever needed to be done in the club so they could continue to rehearse in the club, eventually play some gigs in the club, and also so the Barrow brothers could keep a close eye on their investment. And around 1980, the lineup that is the classic Duran Duran lineup filled itself out with yet another Taylor on guitar, Andy Taylor, who was actually the only member of the band that wasn't from Central England. He was from the Northeast. And he read an ad for a guitarist, came down, and he actually had more musical chops than anyone else in the band at that time, as he'd been playing in cover bands for years. So he had a little bit more knowledge of music construction, a little more virtuosity on his instrument, a little more idea of how music should be constructed. And that would all come in handy when they finally started getting ready to record. The band was finalized when a singer by the name of Simon Le Bon joined the band. And famously, there's a story about him showing up for the audition in a pair of pink leopard skin pants. And the rest is history, as they say. So starting in 1980, the lineup was solid. And by that time, they had been noticed by some record companies. It came down to a bidding war, and eventually EMI signed them. And they started recording their first album. So what do I like about Duran Duran? We talked about the fact that a lot of people that liked them for their looks or their style. But what I like about them was the music. And I'll tell you what I find different about them. First of all, John Taylor is a pioneer on the bass guitar. I don't care what anybody says. I've got him in my top 10 every time I put together a list of bass players from all time. What he did differently is he made the bass guitar a lead instrument rather than just part of the rhythm section. Let's listen to a little sample and you see what I mean. Now, besides John's style of playing the bass, there's also, of course, Nick's very experimental, moody, stylistic keyboard and synthesized playing. And then there's the argument that synthesizer tends to have with Andy Taylor's guitar. Now, Andy and Nick were probably the two biggest driving forces in writing the music for the first couple of albums in particular. And I say argument because Nick, of course, always wanted the sound of Duran Duran to be synth-based, and a lot of the times it was. But Andy was a rock and roll guitarist, and so he always wanted to rock out a little more. Duran Duran was at their best when they met somewhere in the middle, and those two had a conversation, or an argument, if you will, with each other in a song. That's when they were at their best. So that's another thing that I like about the band. And the third thing that really stood out for me and still stands out for me is Simon Le Bon's lyrics. When he joined the band, he brought a notebook with him full of song lyrics already. He didn't know how to write music, but he could sure write poetry. Lyrics, are all over the place when it comes to style and content. You've got your straight up boy meets girl type lyrics. You've got other lyrics like Shooting Star from Bad Company comes to mind right off the top of my head that kind of tell a story. But then you've got lyrics that are purely poetry set to music. Simon wrote a lot of those lyrics. Yes, he did write some boy and girl type romance lyrics, but he wrote a lot of lyrics that didn't tell a story and at first didn't seem to go well together or to make some sense from time to time even. But it was pure poetry. Let me read you an example. I want to make sure I don't misquote, so I wrote a few down. This is an excerpt from The Chauffeur, a song on this album. Way down the lane away, living for another day, the aphids swarm up in the drifting haze. Swim seagull in the sky towards that hollow western isle. My envied lady holds you fast in her gaze, and the sun drips down, bedding heavy behind, the front of your dress all shadowy lined, and the droning engine throbs in time with your beating heart. Some people would hear that and think it was gibberish or silly. I heard it and I thought it was pure poetry, and I still do. I just listened to this album today while I was doing some chores just to refresh my memory on the nuances of all the tracks, and I still think that the lyrics to that song are absolute beautiful poetry. Then there's also the song on this album, Save a Prayer, one of the big songs on the album. Where Simon actually makes a one-night stand not sound crass or physical, but sound like a very special event in the lives of two people that they're both going to remember longingly for the rest of their life. That's what he could do with the lyrics. So I really love that one as well. Let's look at all the tracks on the album, and I'll just maybe mention a couple. Of course, Rio, the title track, very interesting video shot mostly on a yacht, comes to mind. So most people have heard that one, and most people know Hungry Like the Wolf. Now, I don't have to explain what the lyrics of that one are talking about. A lot of people have also heard Save a Prayer, as I mentioned before, but there's some really good deep tracks on here. Lonely in Your Nightmare is one that stood out to me. Very beautiful song. And again, also The Chauffeur, as I mentioned earlier, which has a video that's incredibly artistic, doesn't even feature the band. But yeah, check that video out sometime, but it's not safe for work. So be mindful when you put it on. After this album, as I said, the direction started to change a little bit and become a little more poppy. The next album, 7 in the Ragged Tiger, and by the way, the Ragged Tiger is Fame, and 7 are the 5 members of the band and the 2 Barrow brothers. That's how important the members of the band viewed their 2 managers and the guys that helped get them started, that they actually considered themselves a team of 7 rather than a team of 5. But that album, 7 in the Ragged Tiger, though it has some good tunes on it, in my mind is a little bit of a fall off from this one. And they started to develop some of those creative differences that you hear bands talk about all the time. And ultimately ended up splitting into 2 camps and 2 side projects. John Taylor and Andy Taylor, and by the way, none of the Taylors are related to each other, just all have the same last name. John and Andy formed a band called Power Station with Robert Palmer and Tony Thompson. We'll probably talk about the album they did with those guys at some point. That was the first concert I ever went to. It's a really good album. We'll talk about it at some point. The sound of that band was very hard rock and with a little bit of dance and funk mixed in with it, but very hard rock sounding album. So Andy got to really show out and be the rock guitarist that he always wanted to be. The other 3 members of the band, Roger Taylor, Nick Rhodes, and Simon Le Bon, formed a side project called Arcadia. Now, while Power Station sounded nothing like Duran Duran, Arcadia sounded exactly like Duran Duran. In fact, I view Arcadia, that album that they made, as just another Duran Duran album, and it's in the same place on the shelf in my record collection as all the Duran Duran albums. So that's how I view it, very, very much the same. But they formed those 2 side camps and did come back together to play Live Aid, actually, and to do a song for a soundtrack for a James Bond film called A View to a Kill, but it was really over at that point. And after that, Roger retired because he was tired of a life of fame. Andy left the band to start his a solo project, his own solo work, and got a really, really lucrative record deal. But ultimately, that album that he made, Thunder, kind of flopped, and so it didn't go anywhere really. And they continued on as a trio. John, Nick, and Simon recorded another great album called Notorious, and continued on, and the band still exists today. At some point, all 5 members got back together again and recorded a couple of albums, started touring again. I got to see them on tour, thankfully, when 4 out of the 5 members were still a part of things, and it was a really great experience to get to finally see them live for the first time, so that was great. Well, when I was thinking about what kind of bourbon I might pair with this, I scanned the shelf and saw the name Taylor sticking out like a sore thumb right there in the middle of my bourbon shelf. So what better bourbon to talk about this week than Colonel E.H. Taylor. So E.H. Taylor is my wife's favorite bourbon, and it is a lovely thing to have a spouse that enjoys bourbon, not quite as much as I do, but not far behind actually. In fact, we spent a big part of our honeymoon in the state of Kentucky visiting distilleries. Probably took 3 or 4 tours and popped in the gift shops of 3 or 4 other distilleries. And one of the distilleries we visited was the one that this product comes from, the Buffalo Trace Distillery. It's kind of odd in one way that I haven't mentioned the Buffalo Trace Distillery in detail yet on this show, because a lot of my favorite products come from the Buffalo Trace Distillery. But on the other hand, it makes sense that I haven't mentioned it yet, because a lot of the products from that distillery are highly sought after and have been extremely difficult to find over the last several years. So they're not haven't been they haven't been everyday drinkers for me. They're been special occasion bourbons. You know, I'll pull them off the shelf, I don't know, once a month, and for each one, and had to be sparing with them because I knew I couldn't replace them. But that's all changed. In fact, there is another video on my YouTube channel that specifically talks about supply and demand in the bourbon industry. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, go take a look at that video. I won't get into it in detail for this show, but let's just say things have changed, and all of a sudden you can find this bottle and several other Buffalo Trace products, hint, hint. All of a sudden you can find them again on the shelf, and you can find them at MSRP rather than the inflated prices that people have had to pay when they could find them. So I guess it makes sense in one way that I haven't mentioned Buffalo Trace yet, but they are probably the most respected and probably the biggest producer of bourbon in the state of Kentucky right now. And this particular bottle is the one that I pour for my wife a lot of the time because I know it's her favorite, and it's in my top 10 too. It's not my favorite, but it's right up there. The Buffalo Trace distillery is really they're a little mysterious about their age statements and their mash bills, which is kind of silly because everybody knows what they are anyway. So there's no published age statement on this product, but everybody knows it's aged 6 to 8 years, somewhere in that ballpark. There's also no published mash bill other than to say they use their Buffalo Trace mash bill number 1, but they don't disclose what that mash bill is. But everybody knows that mash bill number 1 is 89.5% corn, 7% rye, and 3.5% malted barley. So that makes it a low rye bourbon. You know, I've mentioned some products on here before that I consider high rye bourbons that are in the 30 to 35% range. So a 7% rye compared to those is a very mild bourbon, although it is a little spicier than your wheated bourbons are. So this one's in a really nice spot. A lot of people mention that they get a lot of caramel and vanilla in the aroma. I've never gotten that. I get just a little bit of a floral aroma actually. So I guess my nose is just a little bit different than everyone else's. But I do get the flavor note that a lot of people mention, and that is butterscotch. Yeah. It's got a really lovely butterscotchy finish, and so makes it a really nice product to have on your shelf. You can find it now. MSRP is $70, and oftentimes at the liquor stores that I go to, it's not even on a shelf behind the counter anymore. It's right out on the floor, so you can just walk in and grab a bottle. So it's one that I definitely recommend. In fact, if you're building a collection from scratch and budget is not a consideration, it would be for most of us, including me, but if it's not a consideration, this is one of the 10 bottles you need to get as one of your first 10. A really good product, and one that we are pouring more often around here lately. Well, thanks for tuning in and joining me and talking about Duran Duran and Colonel E.H. Taylor bourbon. And next week's episode is going to be another interview, and so I'm looking forward to sharing that with you. And enjoy your week, and cheers.